COVID-19 blame game, Huawei and ZTE, Hong Kong, and visa restrictions affecting hundreds of thousands of Chinese students. Everywhere you turn these days, relations between China and the U.S. seems to be in a sorry state. Speaking on Thursday, China's top diplomat sent a direct message to Washington. What were the key points, and how did Washington respond? Joining me now via satellite is Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and via Skype, Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research of Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. Welcome to both of you. That is our topic, and this is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Dr. Zhao, it's great to see you and see you finally via video. There are different interpretations on State Councilor Wang Yi's speech, obviously. Some people claim that China is ready to reconcile with the U.S. Others say this is merely a restatement of China's foreign policy vis-a-vis the U.S. How do you interpret the speech?
I think at this point it's very important to look at the bilateral relationship. It's at a turning point where the U.S. is adding more and more sanctions against China and having this whole-of-government approach that's changing its strategic approach towards China. And China needs to respond to the U.S. from a strategic way and to make clear where China stands and how China will respond to whatever the U.S. is throwing at us. So I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi's speech is very important to clarify China's standing at this point, and it reiterated China's position regarding how to deal with the United States and also to the general world, outside world. So I think it's very, very important to look closely into his speech about how to resolve the problems currently existing between the two countries and what China's attitudes towards the current situation between the two countries. I don't think China changed in regarding to the U.S. or softened its stance. On principle, we will still insist on what we have always been, to protect China's sovereignty and also insisting the right to development and our core interest. However, on other issues, as Foreign Minister Wang Yi indicated, that we're willing to negotiate and to find pragmatic solutions with the U.S. side. And now I think the ball is on the U.S. side. Whether or not they accept this offer, that's up to them.
Well, Dr. O'Hanlon in Washington, D.C., your thoughts on Wang Yi's speech?
Thank you, and it's nice to be with you today. Well, first of all, I've already scanned today's morning newspapers here in the United States on Friday, July 10th, and there's actually not much mention of the speech, which is interesting because we all know that the U.S.-China relationship is prominent in the discourse today in the United States on a wide range of issues, from economic matters to strategic and military matters to diplomacy to President Trump's political strategy going into his re-election campaign. So I think that this is not meant as disrespect, but it just goes to show that the United States is preoccupied. We're preoccupied with the COVID crisis. We're certainly preoccupied with the so-called Black Lives Matter and racial issues that have intensified since the end of May. We are increasingly interested in the presidential race, which of course leads to an election less than 4 months from today. And so I would conclude this opening thought by saying that whatever is being spoken today about U.S.-China relations on either side needs to bear in mind that right now President Trump faces a very difficult re-election effort and may very well not be the American president 6 months from now. And so we should also be paying attention to broader political currents in the United States and also what Vice President Biden is saying about China, and not get too concerned about the day-to-day tweets and rhetoric by President Trump, which sometimes then necessitate a Chinese response or sometimes are in response to a Chinese speech. Again, I'm not trying to downplay yesterday's speech. I'm just trying to say that in the broader American context, it's not necessarily getting a huge amount of attention, and the day-to-day dealings of the U.S.-China relationship right now may be superseded by a Biden presidency.
Well, Dr. O'Hanlon, guess what? I wouldn't be surprised. I just came back from Washington, where I worked for 8 years. It's really hard to get into the news cycle over there. But what do you personally think of Wang Yi's speech? He made many points over there.
Well, I think it is true that we Americans, and this is a broader comment, but it refers to the speech as well, but we Americans are going to have to accept that China is the other superpower, and that it's going to sometimes push and assert itself in ways that we don't prefer and that we may not like, but in some cases we're going to have to be flexible. China is going to have to realize, however, that there are certain kinds of statements and actions and claims that it makes that are not really consistent with being a responsible superpower, especially in regard to the South China Sea and the claims that its 9-dash line creates some version of sovereignty there. And so I think we have to really work hard at that issue in particular. And of course, this week's news is largely about the U.S. aircraft carrier deployments to the South China Sea. On this particular issue, I do not think the United States can show any flexibility at all. The South China Sea is international waters, and China's going to have to accept that. On many other points, I believe that China's views are indeed fair or understandable or perhaps inevitable for a rising power. And so far, I think China has been a fairly restrained rising power by the standards of world history, at least. But on the South China Sea issue, I'm afraid that we're going to have to make it clear to Chinese friends that these are international waters, and being able to access them is at the core of the rules-based international order that has been so beneficial to all of us for so many decades now.
I think Beijing would dispute the claim that, you know, within the 9-dash line, the area, it is international waters. Dr. Zhao, let me go to you. Foreign Minister Wang Yi also stated that China and the U.S. should not seek to change each other's systems. He said that the world should not be viewed in binary thinking. China will not and cannot be another America. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that no matter how many times China says that it is unique, it's not going to challenge America's superiority, many audience in the West still don't buy it.
Well, yeah, because two things. Number one, the U.S. and other Western powers are now emphasizing that they're not really concerned about intentions, they're concerned about capabilities. Once you have that capability, and because of the distrust from the U.S. side towards China's political system, they believe one way or another, China ultimately will use that power against the Western political and economic system. That is very clear in the case of Huawei and ZTE, and today about TikTok. When they talk about these internet companies, they always recite a law in China concerning national security, asking the help of companies to provide information when things are pertinent to national security. However, that's a very limited scope, only related to national security. Today, the national security concept is actually abused by American side. And also, my second point is that Americans and Western powers, in many ways, look at China thinking in a mirror, you know, looking at their own history, their own colonial and imperial history,
yes, I guess
thinking that once you have the power, you will repeat that history.
Well, Dr. O'Hanlon, do you agree?
I think it is true that we have to think in these kind of historical terms about the ways that rising powers behave. And yes, there are a lot of American strategists who expect that China will probably do the same thing that previous rising powers have done historically. And of course, you all know that Graham Allison, the Harvard professor, that his book is very popular. It's called Destined for War, although the subtitle is then called Escaping Thucydides' Trap. And Allison goes back even to ancient Greek and Roman times and talks about how rising powers almost inevitably wind up in clashes with established powers. But if you read Allison's book more carefully, and a lot of us try to, then you also realize there are times where there are peaceful transitions. And in this case, I don't mean a transition to Chinese dominance, but I mean a transition to two superpowers, especially in the broader Western Pacific region. And I think we Americans are going to have to adjust to that a little bit, and we're going to have to bear in mind the historical challenge of trying to be a little bit flexible as a rising superpower arrives. But China is also going to have to think very clearly. Now, going back to your earlier point, you were right. Beijing does not accept that the South China Sea is international waters. I think Beijing is wrong, and dangerously wrong. On issues like Taiwan, we Americans need to be understanding of just how important this issue is to China. On issues like the role of the Communist Party in leading China, we Americans need to be understanding. But on the South China Sea, whatever Chinese law says right now, the international rules-based order that has been so successful for all of us, I think, is more important. And these are open blue waters. These are the kinds of trade routes that have been used by the region for decades. The notion that China can control access to those waters is fundamentally dangerous, whether Chinese law allows it or not. So on that point, you see American strategists feeling a certain confirmation that, yes, China is starting to behave the way that rising powers generally do, which makes it so dangerous when you have a rising power. So if you, to my last point, if you understand what I'm saying, I'm being partly critical of China, but I'm also being partly critical of the United States. We need to be a little bit flexible on some things and understand that China will be more assertive. But on core issues of the rules-based global order that preserves peace and stability and international trade, I think China needs to recognize the South China Sea has to be open to everyone.
Well, Dr. Zhao, do you want to respond to what Dr. Hanlon said about South China Sea and those security concerns?
Yeah, I want to clarify two things. Number one, China never said that night-dash line is China's border on the sea. And also, secondly, I think China has repeatedly said that the freedom of navigation through South China Sea has never been impeded. So to claim that somehow China has closed South China Sea and militarized the whole area is just probably false. And also, in this, I mean, recently China has tried to reduce the tension in the area and try to cooperate with countries like Philippines to share the resources and solve the dispute of sovereignty issues. And at this point, I think sending 2 aircraft carriers into the region only increased the tension instead of, maintaining regional stability and to uphold the international law. By the way, the United States is not a country that signed the UN clause, the UN convention. So I think it's really interesting that the U.S. would claim, based on that international law against China, and China, on the contrary, is a signatory of that international law, and so far has been abided by it. One thing is that China refused to accept the result of the arbitrary court, because China has the right to refuse that, and also that particular court has no right in terms of judging sovereignty issues in that area. So I really don't think that the U.S. should be worried about the free passage through that area, and China has never had any intention of cutting that.
Well, gentlemen, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on that point. Yes, Beijing stated its positions very clearly on the issue of South China Sea and why it doesn't accept the arbitration 4 years ago. Let's move on to some other issues. For example, Washington's strategy towards China. Dr. O'Hanlon, do you think that there is such a thing as the silent majority, maybe, in Washington these days, who are actually neutral or pro-engagement with China, but right now they dare not speak out or speak up because it is politically correct or ideologically correct to bash China, given what's happening right now? Do you think things will be different if there would be another administration after November?
It's a very good question. And by the way, there's also a silent silent American majority in favor of ratification of UNCLOS. So I agree with my Chinese friend. Most of us Americans would actually like to see that convention ratified by the United States, and it would make it more clear our support for these very rules that we think are so important. But in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, it is changing. And I think we all know that. We're not going to have quite as easy of a rapport as, let's say, we might have had in certain other periods, let's say in the Clinton presidency, for example, most of which was relatively calm, or for much of the Bush presidency after the initial P3 incident was resolved. And so I think we're in a more complicated world. China's more powerful. The United States is more worried about China's claims, which, with all due respect to my friend, have become more assertive in regard to the South China Sea, and also the East China Sea, and now the China-India border, although we Americans aren't quite as concerned about that ourselves. But as China becomes more powerful, I think we are going to see a change in the American approach. And we're not going to go to a Cold War mentality. President Trump may have a little bit of that. Most of the rest of us do not have that. We know that the future of the 21st century is going to be largely defined by how the United States and China can work together. So we better not turn this into an adversarial relationship.
Well, Dr. O'Hanlon just said that President Trump himself does not have a Cold War mentality. Does have a Cold War mentality, but many believe that Trump did not at least. He may have some now, but he was really surrounded by those hawkish ideologues, you know, the conservative strategists who were advocating for a Cold War mentality.
Well, you know, President Trump hires his own advisors, so at some point you have to give him the blame or the credit for whatever they're saying as well. So I do think that President Trump, he's tried to maintain a certain personal relationship with President Xi, but he's also very tough on China. And his policies don't even really add up to a single strategy because we all know that he's a little bit impulsive. He's not my favorite American president, and I don't think he really thinks strategically the way a lot of us would define that term. But I think that what you're saying, going back to your earlier question, just to be very clear, there is not a silent majority in favor of restoring a simple, easy U.S.-China relationship like we used to have 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. However, there is a realization that if we can be tougher and more resilient in some areas, then we can still build a new partnership with China. Vice President Biden's speech yesterday showed how we need to reduce our dependence on China in certain areas, but at the same time avoid having a confrontation. And the idea of a confrontation with China or even an arms race would not be something that most Americans would want.
Well, Dr. Zhao, in Beijing, you know, talking about China bashing, it is, you know, getting only more severe. Many say that a country's foreign policy is an extension of its domestic politics. So to what extent do you think the current China bashing in Washington has to do with its domestic politics, and how much is its principled foreign policy?
Well, absolutely, but I think they related to both international, foreign policy and domestic policy. On the one hand, I think the U.S. is continuing its pressure on China and bashing on China because they try to reach a goal using whatever tools in their hands, but so far it's not effective. Therefore, they're just trying to put more chips on the table and trying to bet against China using more sanctions. That's one thing to explain why people like Pompeo and Navarro is trying, put more and more sanctions against China. On the other hand, I think President Trump needs a domestic boost for its re-election campaign, and now bashing China seems to be the right way to do it because he has done really poorly in terms of curbing COVID-19 domestically in the United States. So blaming China and also any international organizations like WHO related to China is one domestic solution probably for his campaign problems now that he is behind in the polls of former Vice President Biden. So I think overall you have to combine this together, and I think in terms of the peoples in the White House, they're using each other. Trump is using the neocons in his administration to bash China, but on the other hand, I think those neocons that you mentioned, conservative strategists, are using Trump also to reach their goals of probably promoting Cold War 2.0.
Mm-hmm. Right. There are many specific issues and the fallout of U.S.-China confrontations, from student visas to academic cooperation to COVID-19. Let's look at some comments online. People are really concerned about the lack of vaccine, and they're asking questions on how fast a vaccine can be delivered so people will be spared of this pandemic. Jim Garner said that China's government is pro-science while the U.S. is anti-science. China united provinces and city efforts to relieve Wuhan and protect the rest of China using strategy, planning, technology, and science to stop the epidemic. The U.S. has no national plan, and the White House is silencing scientists. Dr. O'Hanlon, to what extent is that true?
I think there's no doubt that two things are true, and frankly, they should make both of our countries think a little bit harder. First of all, the virus originated in China and was kept quiet for a month when information should have been shared. And second, the United States has done a very bad job in the last few months dealing with the virus when China has done much better. I think those are just realities, and they say that both countries need to rethink some of their approaches. And right now, we are doing a poor job. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of us are very nervous about what this means for our country, our economy. And, it's starting to look very hard for President Trump to win re-election because, of course, he is the commander-in-chief at a time when the response is going so badly, which is not only a problem for public health, but a problem for economic recovery. So I actually agree with the idea that the United States deserves a lot of criticism for how it's handling COVID right now.
Well, right, Dr. O'Hanlon, I appreciate what you said. You know, talking about student visa, that is an issue of grave concern. 400,000 Chinese students are currently in the United States, and many of them who are taking online courses could be potentially impacted. So my next question is regarding the U.S. Visa ban towards those overseas students, you know, who are taking online courses. Right now, they're asked to pay the same tuition, and you know, their visas will be revoked. Harvard and MIT are now suing the Trump administration over the move. Do you think this move is in any ways targeting the sizable overseas Chinese student?
Yes, I'm afraid so. And I think that, as we all know, there are going to be tensions in the U.S.-China relationship, and we have concerns about intellectual property protection. And on this point, I think China has caused part of the problem historically, even though I think the United States is overreacting right now on the student visa issue. But I teach at a couple of universities part-time, and a lot of these universities are trying to figure out how they can allow overseas students to qualify for remaining in the United States, even if those universities may be largely online. They're hoping they can have some courses that would allow Chinese students here and other foreign students here to qualify for visas by having a hybrid model for at least 1 or 2 courses per semester. So part of what they're trying to do, just like Harvard and MIT, is to actually disagree with the U.S. government and to try to challenge that policy, which I think goes way too far.
Well, Dr. Zhao, in Beijing, the U.S. has also banned Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE from operating domestically in the U.S. and is now threatening to block access to popular apps such as TikTok. The U.S. cities they cited the national security concerns. Do you think the concept of national security has been abused these days?
Well, I've been saying this for, I think, almost 2 years now. From the very beginning, the U.S. Launched this tech war against China based on the very vague claim of national security. And people asking the Trump administration to really bring those evidence to the front. And they have never shown any concrete evidence against those companies, including Huawei and ZTE, that somehow those companies really harmed the U.S. national security. So, I mean, this is really some sort of prejudgment on the U.S. side. Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, has repeatedly said that he has no real evidence, only because China's law requiring those companies to submit information in terms of national security needs, that he is really against those companies. So I think overall, at the end of the day, these people are using ideology to replace real national security needs and using that as an excuse to cut off the competition of Chinese companies in the U.S. market. So who's benefiting from this result? I think nobody is benefiting, because if you cut off Huawei, ZTE, and other Chinese tech companies from the U.S. market, there's less competition, less investment, and less cooperation in developing new technology in the world. So I think that's why I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi's speech was very important, because he offered a pragmatic solution on this issue. I think China and the U.S. should work together to delineate the boundaries between dual-use technology, military technology and civilian technology, and also the boundaries of national security and commercial use of technology. Otherwise, if everything is national security, then the business will be decoupled at the end of the day, and is no use or no benefit to both of our countries.
Well, that leads to my next question regarding the boundary of national security. Dr. O'Hanlon, do you think the two sides perhaps should clearly define what national security really is, and really perhaps narrow the domain of national security? And do you think the two sides have enough political capital and popular support to go for it?
No, I don't really think that this is an area where we're going to see the kind of compromise we might have had 20 or 30 years ago, because in fact 5G is national security. It's national security in terms of who is reaching the cutting edge of new technology faster. It's national security in terms of potential for intelligence operations. It's national security in terms of who can access each other's infrastructure and potentially jeopardize it in the event of a crisis. So I'm afraid on this point I have to disagree with my Chinese friend. I understand that we would like to see commercial cooperation wherever we can, and I agree that so far Huawei and ZTE have not exploited their commercial advantages to the detriment of Western security. However, I also think that as strategists, we need to anticipate where this relationship could go. And having advantages in high technology, that's very important for national security. And allowing a potential competitor to have an advantage is something of considerable concern, especially when the intellectual property is respected more by one side than by the other side. So on this point, I'm afraid that even a definition of national security that's fairly traditional would have to acknowledge that whoever's ahead in high technology and economic power is going to have some national security advantages. Or to put it differently, if we allow ourselves to fall behind, we have some national security vulnerabilities. And so I think the Huawei ZTE issue is going to be very complicated for a long time to come.
Dr. Zhao, do you want to respond?
Well, I think in terms of technology, the U.S. has most of the, leading in most of the areas in technology. So China, if only, having some advantage in 5G, not all of them. U.S. has also a number of companies that are far advanced in 5G development, and also there are European countries in this area. So I don't think China has a monopoly on 5G, and somehow China's participation in the 5G network will harm national security. I think this kind of strategizing 5G is really ahead of ourselves. And because of this kind of thinking, you exclude yourself from finding a pragmatic solution in this area. And actually, if you look at closely to technology, there are ways potentially developed in this area. For instance, the separation of hardware and software, and the control and the customization of software. So I think there are many ways, if we can sit down and negotiate and cooperate with each other to find solutions, instead of looking at this as somehow a hard wall that nobody can penetrate. Again, I think commercial use of technology and national security should have a clear line. And if 5G is in this area, then how about 6G, 7G? In the future technology, we're in this competition. However, competition should have a limit. The government should not intervene in the free competition of the market.
Right. We have about 1 minute left. Dr. O'Hanlon, can you give us a sense of the sentiment of where you are in Washington, D.C. regarding the future of U.S.-China relations? Where do scholars, strategists think the relationship will go, both in the short term and in the long run?
I think people are nervous. I think people feel we haven't yet found a modus vivendi, a way to coexist constructively. I don't think most people expect a war, although those of us who follow the region know that there are enough potential flashpoints that a war could happen inadvertently, and that would be a terrible tragedy for all of us, of course. So I think the more likely scenario is this tense competition that we're going to have to get used to at some level, but find ways to compartmentalize it, to try to cooperate wherever we can, and over time to realize we don't really have anything worth fighting about with each other. There really aren't big enough disagreements that war should ever be a smart option for either country. But it's going to take some time, I think, to reestablish that consensus and to figure out a path forward. So for now, people are anxious, and I think this is probably the great strategic challenge of our day, building an effective U.S.-China relationship for the future.
Right. I want to thank both of our guests, Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and also Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you both so much, gentlemen. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you so much for watching.